How to modify your RAT to be a turbo RAT. Let's add a toggle switch to a RAT so we can switch between two classic RAT sounds. The standard one with 1N4148 silicon clipping diodes, and a turbo RAT which uses LEDs for clipping. Here's a quick sound comparison of the final product to make sure this is a mod worth your efforts. Controls are kept the same and volume was adjusted in post for a fair comparison as the LED mode is significantly louder. Tools and supplies used in this video. You'll need a RAT, a soldering iron, solder, rocket sockets, a center punch, a 1/16 inch drill bit for a pilot hole, a step drill bit for the toggle switch hole, a hand drill or a drill press, 2 clamps for safety while drilling, side cutters or wire cutters, wire strippers, tweezers, a Phillips head screwdriver, desoldering wick or a different way to remove old solder, a foot or so of wire, a DP/DT on toggle switch, and lastly, a pair of 3mm red LEDs. Let's get started. First, remove the 4 screws holding on the bottom half of the enclosure. Depending on how old your RAT is, it may have either a 3.5mm power jack or a modern DC jack. If it's an old style 3.5mm jack, you do not need to do any of the DC jack desoldering steps. Just remove the nut with either a rocket socket or the pliers on the wire stripper depending on the type of nut the DC jack uses. If yours has a modern jack like this, we'll need to remove the wires from the jack to take the PCB out. Take a few pictures for reference, but we'll go over it here. Take your side cutters and clip off the red and white wires about a 1/4 inch or so away from the jack. If it doesn't clip easy, move a little further away from the jack as you might be trying to clip the solder lugs for the DC jack. Now, grip the bare wire with your tweezers. Take your soldering iron and apply some heat to the solder joint of the wire at the DC jack and pull the bare wire away. Now we can proceed to remove the circuit from the enclosure. Grab a knob and pull it straight off. It might be on pretty tightly. If you can't get the knob off, take a cloth or a t-shirt and a flathead screwdriver and gently pry the knob up while rotating it. Once the knobs are off, take your 1/2 inch rocket socket and remove the nuts on the audio jacks. Use a 10mm rocket socket and remove the nuts on the pots. Take a 14mm rocket socket and remove the nut for the foot switch. Remove the circuit board assembly from the enclosure and keep track of all the washers. Using the tweezers, pull the heat shrink off the wires on the DC jack. Take your iron and apply some heat to the lugs while using the tweezers to remove the wires. And lastly, remove your DC jack nut from the inside with the 14mm rocket socket. Now we're going to prepare a hole for the toggle switch. I like to add it on the back of the enclosure, just above the cross section for the in and 9V DC label brackets. I find that this point on the back of the enclosure allows for plenty of room for the switch and won't mess up the face of your pedal. The rest of the video shows a slightly different location used, but the position I just showed you will be the easiest and provide much more room. Take your center punch and punch a divot right where you want the switch to go to help center the bit while drilling. Clamp your enclosure to your work surface, ideally in 2 points. Load up a 1/16 inch drill bit to make a pilot hole and drill a hole through the center punch. Apply firm pressure, but not so hard that you warp or break the bit. We are drilling through steel, so be patient. It may take a while to clear. Use a step drill bit to drill the hole big enough for the switch, or use progressively bigger drill bits. The switch will require a hole a bit bigger than 1/4 inch. Check along the way that the switch fits so that you don't drill too big. Time to desolder the stock clipping diodes. They are located here. We're going to reuse these, so we aren't going to clip them out. Find the corresponding solder pads on the opposite side and add a bit of fresh solder to all the pads to aid in removing the diodes. Grab a diode leg with tweezers. You may need to wedge it slightly under the leg to get a good grip. Once you have a good grip, apply heat to the pad and gently pull it out using your hand against the PCB for leverage. Now that one side is up, the other side will be a lot easier to get out. This may be a little bit tricky overall, but the key here is to not spend too much time heating the joints. It should take less than 5 seconds per diode leg. Remove both diodes. Now, use your desoldering wick to clean up the holes. Rest some fresh wick over the pad, put the iron on top of the wick, and drag as it wicks away the solder. Do this on all 4 of the holes that the diodes used to be in. Now, take your wire and cut it so it is about 3 to 4 inches long. Strip about 1/4 of an inch from each end. Tin the ends by applying a little bit of solder so the wire strands don't fray. Insert a wire into one of the diode holes. Clean the tip of your iron. Add a little fresh solder to the tip. Wedge your iron between the solder pad and the wire. Wait a second. Add a little bit of solder. Remove the solder. Then remove the iron. Now put the other wire into a solder pad on the opposite side of the first wire. Solder it in just like you did with the first wire. Clip off any excess wire coming through the solder pad. Time to prepare the switch. I find it easiest to loosely mount the switch on the reverse side of the enclosure to hold it steady. Take the 2 diodes you removed and identify the cathode. The cathode on these is marked by the black band. These will need to get inserted into the switch with the cathodes in opposite directions like this. Feel free to bend the legs so that they stay in place. Once they are in place, clean the tip of the iron, add a little bit of fresh solder to the tip, hold the iron against the switch lug and diode legs, wait a second, add solder until it flows, remove the solder, then remove the iron. Do this on both sides of the diodes. Now, take your LEDs. The cathode on the LED is marked by a flattened edge of the rim. The cathode also has a shorter leg. Just like with the stock diodes, the LED cathodes need to be facing opposite directions when soldered into the switch. Insert both LEDs facing in opposite directions onto the other side of the switch. Bend the legs so they are held in place. Solder in both sides and clip off the extra leg. Put the interior washers back on the pots and the star washer on the foot switch. Mount the circuit board back into the pedal, put the exterior washers and nuts back on the pots and foot switch, and install them all finger tight. Once they're all finger tight, tighten them down with the rocket sockets. They don't need to be torqued down very hard. Send the 2 wires from the diode spot to the 2 middle open lugs on the toggle switch. It doesn't matter which one goes where. Solder each wire to a lug. The new toggle switch should be all soldered together and look something like this. Mount the switch in the enclosure and tighten it down with the 8mm rocket socket. If you had a modern DC jack you removed, you'll now need to clean up the lugs and reinstall it. Insert from the inside of the enclosure and loosely install the nut. Use the desoldering wick to remove the old solder to make the hole visible for all 3 lugs. After the holes are clear, install the DC jack the correct way in the enclosure and tighten it down with the 14mm rocket socket. Insert the audio jacks back into their holes, install the washers and nuts, and tighten them down with the 1/2-inch rocket socket while holding the jacks so that they don't rotate while tightening. Solder the DC jack back together in reverse order, starting with the bare wire on the lowest lug. With the red and white wires with the ends cut off, strip an 1/8 inch or so with the wire stripper and tin both ends. Solder in the red wire first, then solder in the white wire on top. You're almost done. Now would be a great time to test it to make sure it works. Plug it in and toggle the switch back and forth. If each position sounds different, you successfully modified your rat to be both a standard rat and a turbo rat. Nice job. Screw the bottom of the enclosure back on and then push the knobs back on. And that's it. You are done. Hope you learned something new and had a little fun along the way. Like, subscribe, and visit our website. Happy modding!